All right. Welcome to episode 3. Good to see you, LoLo.
Good to see you, Perry. How are you?
Oh, I'm very excited for today's episode. We're going to be talking about some really interesting stuff with Lehi and the Book of Mormon, and going to pick up wives and all sorts of fun stuff.
You got to get them wives; they're important.
You gotta get them wives. That is what we're going back to Jerusalem for. Let's go ahead and get started. So this week we're talking about 1 Nephi 6 through 10. And we have just gone to Jerusalem at one time, and we're going to be going back again. But first, we have a little bit of church history to cover. And I know that we're not a church history podcast. We're going to emphasize that multiple times in this. But it is relevant to this particular section because the Book of Mormon makes it relevant. And that is the account of the lost 116 pages. Now, before we get into that, we have the lost 116 pages because of Joseph giving those over to Martin Harris, and we'll talk about that history. But what that causes is a situation where it looks like Mosiah wound up being written before the rest of the Book of Mormon that we have today. Now that's not how we read it, right? We usually read from First Nephi and then through to Moroni, but it does look like Mosiah was written before everything else. And this comes about because of, or at least we know about this because of an article by Brent Metcalfe titled The Priority of Mosiah, a Prelude to Book of Mormon Exegesis. It came out in 1993, and it's really kind of rocked the critical and apologetic world ever since. There are multiple articles to the extent that some apologists have even tried to argue that this Mosiah priority is actually faith-affirming. And I'll leave the link here in the slide to Evidence Central's argument that it's faith-affirming. So for those who are on the more faithful side, can go and read that to understand. But basically, what the
anything can be faith-affirming if you really
try hard enough.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I mean, like, this doesn't necessarily harm any particular narrative in and of itself. There's no real bad reason that starting at Mosiah creates an issue, but it does tie into some ideas that are effective for a critical look at the Book of Mormon. We can look at the way that themes and ideas develop over time, and if we start with Mosiah and then work our way through and see how they evolve, we might see a different view on how those ideas are influenced within the text, but also we might see a bit more of Joseph's own fingerprints in the work. And if we are going with the revelation,
go ahead. No. I just said, well, I mean, the Bible, it's common knowledge that it wasn't written in order. So why would it be such a anti-faith affirming?
Right. There's the Markian priority. There's the Markian priority for the Gospels, where Mark is the first one that's written. There are plenty of very faithful Christians who accept that particular order for the writing of the New Testament, that they have no trouble with their faith. And so we don't need to have any issue per se with the Book of Mormon.
Being not out of order, just in a different order.
In a different order, exactly. We start with the large plates and then come back to the small plates. And that's explicitly what's stated as far as like that separation between those texts anyway. So, So there is this very popular, very common story in Mormon circles and LDS circles for sure. And I think it's discussed throughout the whole Mormonism movement of, Martin Harris, Joseph Smith's first compatriot in developing the Book of Mormon and the work of translation. Martin is funding this whole enterprise, and his wife is not too thrilled with what's going on, and he's getting
feminist icon.
Feminist icon Lucy Harris. As we're talking in the pregame, that we stan Lucy Harris. But so she's troubling Martin with these like, hey, I want to see what's going on with where you're throwing our money. And Martin goes to Joseph and says, hey, like, I've got this issue with my wife and I need to show her something of what we're doing. And the records state that Joseph prayed about it, was told no, prays about it again, is told no, prays about it a third time, and God says, fine, but like this is how you can do it. And he gives those 116 pages of handwritten manuscript over to Martin so Martin can show it to his wife. And somewhere along the way, these 116 pages get lost.
Lost, vanished.
Just like gone. And this troubles Joseph quite a bit. We see two major sections of Doctrine and Covenants that deal with this issue and the anxieties that it causes Joseph and the concerns that he has. And Doctrine and Covenants 10, if I recall correctly, has a whole section where the God is like, hey, Joseph, it's okay, buddy. You're forgiven. And here's the way that I'm going to help you to actually solve this particular issue. What Mosiah and priority allows us to do is to take that account of losing the 116 pages and not completely halt the work. Because there's a gap in time between when Joseph is told, like, hey, you're not going to be allowed to translate because you screwed up. And
I was going to say there was a point in time where he wasn't allowed, right?
Right. And then he's told that there's a solution to his woes. But what he's told is he can't really translate those same pages again. And he has to, there has to be this development of a solution to this particular problem. Now, one solution is to rewrite what had been written before. And another solution is to maybe avoid that set of text entirely. But it is narratively important. It's really like vital to actually cover this origin point of leaving the old world and coming to the new. And so you need that Book of Lehi story somehow, some way. Now, the revelations that we have in Doctrine and Covenants make this apologetic argument that the people who have gotten a hold of these 116 pages have altered them in some way. And so doing a word-for-word replication of what had been done before would be used and manipulated to show Joseph as a fraud. And we can't have that, right? I don't know how this original text would have been altered in such a way that the alterations would be convincing to the point that a word-for-word replication would be a problem. But that is at least the argument that's put forward within the Revelations. And then
not going to photocopy it, probably.
Right. Well, I mean, we're not going to be able to run it through, a deep fake algorithm like you talked about in the pregame.
You got to have at least Windows 95 for that, and I don't know if
at least, and, that's 170 years away. So, but even like producing like a forgery or alteration that would be so convincing, that's difficult to do. You can't just scratch out what's there, because now if you're scratching that out, that's going to show like, hey, they made an alteration, not me. Like Joseph now has that argument. But yeah, he has that point to make. They could, the deceitful critics could, say, oh, well, that was scratched out by Martin when we had it, or by the scribe, and this is just how we got it. But like at any point now, I mean, we can see like today how apologetic arguments work, where if you have even just the slightest little hint of something that works towards the faithful narrative, they're going to take that to the absolute extreme. We might talk about horses in America. I don't know, but there is like a study that shows that like a very small, tiny version of the horse may have still been on the American continent, continents, right around the time that Lehi would have been arriving, maybe, possibly, perhaps. I have issues with that article, but my goodness, have apologists that are like aware of it run with it as this like support. There's another study that's come out that shows that the Polynesians that left and were working their way down to actually like settle into like modern day Polynesia made a stop off on the American continent. There's like, and which is interesting because if you know about some Book of Mormon apologetics there, like it's just an interesting idea.
Yeah.
But that study shows that they came around like the 14th century CE. not at all in a time that would line up with Book of Mormon timeframes.
I was going to say just a little bit out of that window.
Yeah, but I had apologists that I've talked to really try to run with that and support it. All that to say, a little scratch mark to try and like alter the text.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to stop the apologetic support. So I'm having a hard time finding a way to really accept the faithful arguments that are here. But the book of First Nephi does support these ideas as well in two different places. The reason why we're even talking about all this church history stuff in this episode is because there are two times in this section alone where the Book of Mormon goes out of its way to discuss this issue and the wise purpose, the apologetic that comes in for why the small plates of Nephi are used.
I don't know why I'm being told to retell this story that we literally just told you, but here we go. And this is not
a good enough writer.
Right. And it's not like he's just going to run and grab a composition notebook and scribble it out. There is effort. It is not writing. It is like chiseling. There is effort into this.
Right. And he has to smelt these plates and go through that whole process of making them. And then he has to go through the effort of writing them. And all he gets is it's a wise purpose.
It's important. It's important to do it.
Now, excuse me, Doctrine and Covenants will refer to this as the wisdom of the Lord. And Nephi is going to refer to it as a wise purpose. These are really similar terms that are used for the same thing. And now, obviously, if God is the one that's saying all this, using similar words, okay, maybe God is just using the same thing to state that. A more critical perspective would indicate that, hey, like the fact that very similar terms are being used in these places is being described as the same thing, the same argument for using the small plates of Nephi is used in Doctrine and Covenants and in First Nephi, might suggest or might rather strongly indicate that these are some of Joseph's fingerprints getting into the text. And if we're going with a loose translation, revelation theory, that's fine. If we're doing a very strict translation where as close as possible to what Nephi originally wrote is what's recorded, it's kind of weird.
A little bit.
It's a little strange. Not a smoking gun, but it is something that is strange and might indicate, more of Joseph's role as translator bleeding into the authoring of these texts.
And it wouldn't be such an issue if this was just a once or twice off thing, like you were saying, but it's fingerprints, not fingerprint. So the fact that, yes, you can excuse away once or twice, but when it becomes a habit, it's a little bit harder to excuse.
Right. And we're going to point to a lot of different places where we see like Joseph Smith's fingerprints or 19th century ideas bleeding into the text. And when those ideas are getting shoved in there over and over again, just as you said, it starts to look like a pattern that moves us away from supporting history, like a high level of historicity. Right, we're already sub 100. Last week we got below 100% historicity. This week we're starting to kind of chip away at those higher levels more and more, and that's going to be an issue, especially as we're in the section that is the most testable. Historically speaking, this section had of the Book of Mormon, First Nephi, we have the most going on for historical like vetting and review. Okay. So what do we do with all of this? I mean, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about that narrative, the last 116 pages, and now how First Nephi is saying that it is coming in as a way of abridging the Lehi account. And it says that in two different places that it's here to support Dad's book. Like that's what it's here for. And Nephi doesn't really know why it needs to be there, but he's going to do it anyway because God commanded him. And then Doctrine and Covenants helps to show that, this is the wisdom of the Lord, that this wise purpose is the wisdom of the Lord. And that this is avoiding the fraudulent designs of the devil. This isn't a church history podcast, and this is really as far as I want to get into the history that's involved. I just have a hard time accepting that any alterations to the last 116 pages necessitated this work if the hand of the Lord is what's guiding this work.
Right. Because to me, I'm going to see if I can't try and make this make sense. Like you were saying, the faithful are going to be faithful no matter what, but the detractors are going to be detractors no matter what either. So it just seems like, and especially with all of the work that Nephi would have to, if the historical Nephi would have to go through to recreate these plates, I feel like God would have found an easier way to correct the issue.
Right. And if Joseph is going to reproduce the Book of Lehi word for word, or make an attempt at that, and if the critics still have, these critics, these scoundrels are going to reproduce those 116 pages to show Joseph as a fraud, we have a test now for Joseph's capabilities at producing this text. We have a hands-on empirical way of analyzing Joseph's translation abilities with respect to the Book of Mormon. And if he's successful in that test, it is only further evidence of the truthfulness of this work. And so by avoiding that, what it does is it moves all of this out of the realm of testability. We now have no way of comparing really First Nephi to the lost 116 pages. And even if those 116 pages have been reproduced, as long as the general story beats are roughly the same, which is not that hard to do.
You can remember a story you told, at least the big parts,
Right. But getting specific names right, now that's a different kind of challenge. Getting, very specific details or words to put together, that's a different kind of challenge. But broadly touching on the same ideas over again, it's not as hard to do.
Well, and you had made a point in the pregame that we were discussing. I was asking at what point, how influential was the Mormonism wave that was hitting? Was this, were we talking like our Jonestown level? Not to compare Mormonism to the Jonestown, but was it a wave that would have been as society altering that somebody would go to that much effort to try to do all that?
Right. And so the faithful statement on that would be, well, it doesn't matter how big it was at this point in time because Satan knows what it's going to be. And so he's fighting against it tooth and nail to try and overturn that. For taking a critical step, or actually looking at how people tend to operate in the real world, this is a very small movement at this point that only is affected by a handful of families within a small region of the country. Most people are not aware of this at all. You've got the Second Great Awakening still kind of going on at this time, and that is a much bigger deal. You have all sorts of movements that are coming out of this. So what's this other tiny little movement? And yeah, there are some newspapers that are covering this Golden Bible story, but it's this unusual, like, strange idea that's coming out of rural America, not this like movement that needs to be stamped out.
Okay.
There's going to be challenges to it, but they're all pretty niche, pretty small, pretty local. It's not until you get to Ohio and Missouri and Nauvoo that anything that really looks like the significant challenges and persecutions of church history really even start to appear. At this point in time, it's most of the persecutions that Joseph is dealing with are coming from his own ilk.
Okay.
And
so it just seems like a lot of work for what's the payoff,
In terms of a faithful narrative, yes. But in terms of a critical idea, where if Joseph's trying to move this out of the realm of testability, which it has the effect of doing one way or the other, this makes sense. This makes sense, right? Okay, let's actually get into the narrative here. So this slide we're calling Returning to the Scene of the Crime because last week we talked about the murder of Laban.
Totally justifiable, by the way.
The totally justified because if it's better that one man should perish than that an entire nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. Quoting the high priest of the Sanhedrin who would execute Jesus 600 years in advance. We have some issues with all of that we discussed last week. But we're going back to the scene of the crime. This is one of those things that's going to challenge, I think, the historicity claims again of that story. because the murder of Laban doesn't come up at all in the story of Nephi and the brothers going back to Jerusalem to pick up the family of Ishmael to get their women folk for the rest of this journey.
It does seem like something that, I mean, they would maybe mention in passing.
You would think. You would think. And
hey,
that's
brothers, that right there is where I beheaded that man.
You know, we had to be very cautious as we went into the city because of, you know, the death of Laban or, you know, something, but there's nothing in the text here at all. Ishmael doesn't say like, hey, you guys wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you? Like, I mean, there's nothing,
nothing at all.
You know, there is nothing in the text. And there's nothing that comes up later either. So maybe initially in 1 Nephi 7, there's no reason to suspect them. Laban just died and it was horrible and somebody else must have done this.
His head fell off.
His head fell off. His head fell off. He's like the bird Petey in Dumb and Dumber. His head fell off. But I'm good. Okay, back at it. Let's go. But like by the time Ishmael gets to the camp and sees the brass plates that were owned by Laban, that like Lehi knew before that was owned by Laban, this should raise some questions. And he's going to see the sword of Laban in their camp and the armor of Laban. And at no point in time does this come up as an issue.
Hey, doesn't this stuff belong to the guy whose head magically fell off?
But again, like this story, the story of Laban and his murder does not come up ever again. And so I don't know, like it challenges the historicity. And these are, again, the things that really strain at the credulity. It is worth noting that like initially in the story, Laman and Lemuel are super chill with this idea, which I do find kind of funny. They're going back for wives, so they're super chill about this. It's not until they start coming back to the camp
they're gonna get wives.
So. Yeah, right. But that now they've seen their city again, and they're like, "Hey, this isn't great that we're like going back. We don't really love this." And so they tie up Nephi, and it's all horrible. And you know, they're resorting to like abuse tactics really here to be convincing instead of, you know, talking about it and debating and using persuasion to
having a conversation.
Right. And that's not great. That's not great. But Nephi is fortunately going to receive some supernatural assistance. He's going to call them to repentance, and then they're going to go back. The journey continues. Everything is good again. And all of this is taking place at or near the place where they had just murdered Laban. Really worth noting that this is the context and that most likely we're not very far off from the timeline for when all this is going down.
I'm plugging myself back in my...
Okay. So we may notice that we have left Jerusalem, gone to camp, went back to Jerusalem, did a murder, went back to camp, now we've gone back to Jerusalem, and we're going back to camp again. This is a very inefficient way of traveling. So why? Why though? This is one of those questions that you had expressed in the program that you had. I've had it. I think this has come up. This has come up enough that a professor at BYU actually came up with an apologetic argument for it. And
love it. Let's hear it.
I've gone ahead and linked that article all the way back in 1996. He presented this idea in the Church News. It got published in the Church News. But essentially what this comes down to is the argument is that this is essentially a refiner's fire, a test of faith, that they have to go back and forth so many times because they need to have the faithful and those that are going to stay with God shown that that's what they're going to do, and it's going to help them to develop their trust in God over time. And what I see in that is actually more we're riffing on Exodus, and we're riffing on this long journey of leaving a land of captivity to a land, to a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that has been promised to those who are going on this particular journey. And the Exodus story, super inefficient. They are going a relatively short distance that should not take them more than like a year or two. And it's taking them 40 years to do that. And you have Moses going up to Mount Sinai and getting the message from the burning bush, from the Lord in the burning bush. And then he comes down with the tablets, and then he sees all this stuff going on. So he breaks the tablets, and then he has to go back up again and get the law, and on and on and on and on, right? Like these are it's a very inefficient story, but you have a steady refinement of the people over time as they're going through that experience. And these are the same parallels that are walked in the first Nephi account. And
well,
yeah.
And my point on this is, how many different scenarios can you come up with for proof of deity, to prove deity's interaction with the mortals? I mean, you've got to kind of have that, oh no, we've lost our faith. Oh no, we're going to be punished for it. We're being punished for it. Now we have faith again. Oh, we've lost our faith. And it's very cyclical. So, and I mean, not that Joseph Smith was not a gifted writer or storyteller, but you're going to pull from what you know.
You are going to pull from what you know. And if you can pull from, if you're trying to write a holy text and you have this other holy text available and you want that other holy text to also be revered, you might pull from that first one to try and support this other narrative. You're going to want them to look similar, to be familiar, and for people who read it to see this first holy text in this later one.
So would the Book of Mormon be the 50 Shades of Grey fan fiction to the Bible's Twilight?
There are some who have asserted as much. I would look at it more as like this is more like the Book of Hebrews and or the pastoral epistles, riffing off of Paul, trying to look like Paul and to sound like Paul, but presenting these other ideas, but getting their authority by kind of obliquely, sort of, perhaps looking like Paul. And
your comparison works too, I guess.
I'm trying to be as charitable in this, but that I think that what we have going on, I do think what we have going on in the Book of Mormon is pseudepigrapha. That tradition, that way of producing pseudepigrapha, which is like these the false writings, these writings that are meant to be scripture, that look like scripture, are meant to be written by prophets, but written by another person, by some anonymous author. Like I think that we have that in the Book of Mormon because those same telltale signs are showing up. All sorts of parallels and tie-ins with this original holy text. So that way it looks like that, it sounds like that, but it isn't like, I think that if there was a historical Nephi, a historical Lehi, that they're not going to be walking in the same types of steps as these previous stories. They're going to have their own unique experiences that are going to inform their own journeys and their own experiences that are going to look different. They're going to sound different. They're going to smell different. And instead, what we have in the Book of Mormon is stuff that looks like and supports this first thing. Yeah. And not something that has its own unique flair. And it really should be unique because this is a First Temple Jewish text, not where the majority of the Bible as we have it is Second Temple or later.
Right. Like they truly are the prequel.
In so many ways. And so what we should see should like almost inform what we see in the Old Testament.
Right.
And honestly, we don't get that in this text. We get something that instead looks like it's dependent on the first rather than it being informative to what would come later in some theological way. Like the theology and the culture should inform what we're reading in the Old Testament, not the other way around.
Right.
Okay.
This is not a which came first, the chicken or the egg. There is a very clear which should have come first.
Right. There is. Very much so. Very much claimed by the text that that's the order. Now, in addition to that, we should look at the way that this account is reflected in its 19th century context as well, and how much of the fingerprints of the 19th century are showing up in the understanding of what these events are in the early Book of Mormon. So I do want to give Dr. Ogden here credit because in that same article that was cited earlier, he pulls this reference from the Journal of Discourses that we made an allusion to last week, where we talked about Ishmael and Laban probably being descendants of Joseph. Like Laban, definitely a descendant of Joseph, and Lehi, definitely a descendant of Joseph through Manasseh. But Ishmael also probably being a descendant of Joseph through Ephraim. Both of those tribes
now, how common at this point in time would it be? Because this does seem to be a very smaller, more tight-knit unit in the city of Jerusalem amongst this group of people, the Laban sort of social circle. How common would it have been for somebody to be a relative of Joseph?
I mean, there probably wasn't actually a historical Joseph, so there is
right,
that. But for these
in historical
but for these terms, right?
context.
So Second Chronicles does detail a certain subset of Ephraim and Manasseh that were in Jerusalem trying to pay obeisance to Adonai. And since the temple that was left, the first temple, was the only site left during this like pre-exilic time frame post Assyrian destruction of Israel, for them to actually go and really worship Adonai, that's where they're going to head to. And so that's where they go to pay that obeisance. And some of the other historical archaeological records do indicate that there is a tribe of, or a collection of refugees that are living in Jerusalem, that are promoting the Jerusalem economy and really helping Judah to actually flourish now in this post Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom. And most likely this is a small group. Most likely this is not like a huge group per se, because there are other people in this diaspora up north that are going to be the ancestors, the predecessors to like the Samaritans and other groups that make their home there, that have altered versions of Adonai worship and worship of other like of the Canaanite pantheon. And we touched a bit on that last week. We'll get into that again when we talk about Isaiah, because it's relevant there when we talk about early Isaiah and how Israel and Judah were different. This comes up again and again and again, and is not really touched on in the Book of Mormon. Now, that's the historical version of this. But if we were to take the sort of the more faithful position, or at least the position as it would have been understood in the 19th century, well, Kingdom of Israel is basically wiped out under this version. And if we look in the Apocrypha, which gets referenced in Doctrine and Covenants 133, Ephraim and Manasseh and the other 10 tribes were scattered into the northern countries, whatever that means in particular. And so any group that is left to go into Jerusalem is a small part, a very tiny group of refugees, because as 1 Nephi 22:4 will state, the more part of these tribes gets scattered and is sent to and fro and lost. So it's interesting and strange almost that we have 2 to 3 wealthy, prominent families that just vanish and are also among these refugees.
Yeah.
Typically, refugees are not the wealthiest group.
I was going to say they don't tend to be the well-to-dos. I get that there were the Howells in Gilligan's Island, but they are not.
What you typically have instead is, if you have a wealthy person, there's somebody who is already living in that area, and then they exert more power and influence over that refugee population. And so what we would expect instead is that Laban would be not a descendant of Joseph, and would be exerting power and influence over those who were descendants of Joseph.
There we go. Okay.
We don't see that, right? What we have explicitly in the text is Laban is a descendant of Joseph, and that runs afoul of the historical setting and narrative here. It's possible maybe that we don't have the brass plate, so it's possible that Lehi and Nephi misread it and saw Laban as something that he wasn't. But that gets problematic for other reasons, and then we're also speculating. So, but yeah, if I'm trying to afford some amount of grace to that, I might go with, well, maybe Laban wasn't a descendant of Joseph at all, and is just claiming that or exerting influence in such a way.
Misunderstood.
Right. So what I want to talk about here is that in the 19th century, the early 19th century, there is this idea that you have these scattered, lost tribes. They went somewhere. They went into the northern countries, whatever that means. And now we're settling in this new world, and we're seeing, these depopulated areas where we're settling in. And you've got, and I'm going to use this term because I'm going to avoid using that term. Never mind. It's not worth using. You've got these indigenous people who are not, and our understanding, in our 19th century understanding, not capable of, great technological works. And they're off in the frontier area and all of that, and they're living these lives that are without civilization. And yet what we're finding is these signs of like great buildings, of these huge mounds that would have required like really great works of engineering to go about actually making. And there's just no way that these people who are living on the frontier could have possibly done this. So what there must have been is this white race of mound builders who built these up and then were eventually destroyed by these other people. And this is a common myth called the mound builder myth. And I really recommend Dan Vogel's work on this. We're going to link down in the description one of Dan Vogel's videos on that. He's done great work on the mound builder myth, has books on the subject, just fantastic scholarship covering the mound builder myth and its influence on early Mormonism.
I heard a statement at one point, and it said that there doesn't have to be a white savior that comes in and builds these things. Maybe just a pyramid is the easiest shape to build, and that's why you see them everywhere.
Right. And honestly, like with these mounds, like the mounds are impressive. These are really impressive, large earthen works. And the signs of what was done would have been very, very impressive as well. Yeah, maybe building these things is just a thing that people can do. And people did it because they can do it. And it's useful. Like, I mean, having a giant mound as a place to build a city on top of is still useful, as for military purposes or for
physics is just physics.
Yeah.
The laws of nature are just the laws of nature. Just because this race is lighter skinned, this race is darker skinned.
Right.
In the end, we can all build a pyramid.
Right. But in the 19th century, I mean, even today, we see signs of this because if you watch like Ancient Aliens and you see them talking about like, look at what impressive structures they're talking about and consider the races of the people that are being helped. Because, there's a certain shade, there's a certain skin tone at which aliens have to start getting involved.
But I mean, obviously, we know that show is also historically correct.
Oh, because it's on the History Channel. But we see like these ideas persist. Because for one, white supremacy is like a hell of a drug. But for two, like when these ideas get so like absorbed into the culture, they have a tendency to just kind of keep getting perpetuated. And if you have this idea that these like people are just incapable of civilization, there must have been something else that contributed to that. And before you had Ancient Aliens, what you had was the mound builder
Jesus
myth.
magic.
Yeah, basically, right? You have this mound builder myth coming in, and that appears in A View of the Hebrews. Now, A View of the Hebrews is often used as this like argument of like, oh, look at how Joseph like plagiarized these ideas from A View of the Hebrews. I don't read it that way. Most critics today will not use A View of the Hebrews as something that Joseph plagiarized from. But instead, what you have is this essay about a lost tribes group that was available to Oliver Cowdery through his pastor, Ethan Smith, and it details the scenario of the lost tribes coming to the American continent and acting as progenitors to the indigenous inhabitants here. And this is thematically very similar to the ideas that are in the Book of Mormon, which suggests that potentially independently, these two, Joseph Smith and Ethan Smith, could have come up with these ideas because the mound builder myth was available in the milieu. It was informing these ideas and this understanding of how the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas came here, how they arrived, how they started building up their communities and their civilizations. And
now, I was watching something about this. I want to say it was on Mormon Stories, I think. I'm not 100% sure. So my question to this is, there was some question, and I guess I'm kind of technically playing apologist advocate. There was some question that the writing eloquence and the writing level of the essays was not quite the same, or was it a different level than Joseph Smith? But then I've also seen conflicting where they were basically on the same level and could very easily have come from the same author. How?
So I am with Jim Bennett and others on this one that like if you look at a view of the Hebrews, there's no real association between the two texts. Not in
Okay.
terms of like actual of actual content, of style, of word choice, anything like that. They're just
more inspiration.
so I don't even necessarily need for my understanding of the situation for Joseph to have even actually directly been aware of a view of the Hebrews at any point in time. Oliver clearly was, or at least had the opportunity to be aware of that. So, I mean, there's such I really think very strongly that Oliver Cowdery was aware of this text. But Joseph may or may not have been. It honestly doesn't actually matter. What does matter is you have two different Smiths, Ethan and Joseph, coming up with very similar ideas. And you have in the milieu and the general environment around them this idea of a white mound building race who acted as the progenitors of the indigenous Americans. Either way, that how these texts ended up overlapping or not overlapping or anything along those lines, what you have is a clear environmental influence, a 19th century influence that can be fed right into the Book of Mormon. And a view of the Hebrews is an evidence of how that influence can show up in other places.
I understand now. Okay.
Yeah. So
thank you for never making me feel dumb with the 87 questions that I
no, these are great questions. These are important questions that come up. And I think there's a lot of like misunderstanding of among critics and against critics, where like you'll see some like especially new critics who have just read the CES letter and are like, oh, look at all these bad things about the church, saying like, oh, he plagiarized from a view of the Hebrews. And no, like I don't think that is a tenable argument. And then you'll see people who are like making polemics against critical arguments saying, oh, you critics just think that he plagiarized all this stuff. And I don't think he plagiarized a thing, honestly. I think this is, apart from the clear plagiarisms of the King James Version of the Bible, and potentially plagiarisms of some 19th century sermons that show up in the text that he may have just gotten copies of or jotted down copies of and brought in. I don't think Joseph plagiarizes a thing in this text. I think the narrative of the text is him. I think that he is coming up with that. And I don't need these other things. But what these things do show is that there is in the milieu these ideas, and Joseph can receive inspiration from them. This isn't coming entirely out of left field. It's not that, you know, like this idea was so completely foreign that there's no way that Joseph could have come up with it. Like, no, there's a seed, there's a place that this could come from, an inspiration, and here you go down the chain, and here's somebody else who was doing the same thing.
Right. This is well-known lore for the area.
Right.
The time.
Yep. That's exactly what it does. Yeah, so that's really the role. Like I see it with a view of the Hebrews. We'll go back just to kind of close the loop on that. Next slide jumps into a different topic. All we really have with this is thematic links, but we do show a 19th century, as what I want to hammer home. We have a 19th century influence for talking about the lost tribes, and the Book of Mormon is consistent with that 19th century type of view about the lost tribes and the mound builder myth. And it's not as consistent with what we know about the historical side of that, where you have what is most likely a destruction of the ruling class of the Northern Kingdom and some refugees coming into Jerusalem, and the people that are left behind largely constituting the progenitors of the Samaritans and other Canaanite groups. Like that's more the historical side, and that's less consistent with what the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants are putting forward. But what those texts are putting forward is much more consistent with the 19th century idea instead, which is, again, more fingerprints of the 19th century of Joseph Smith into, oh no.
You fell again. I'm so sorry. I don't even know how it happened that time.
Yeah, Satan calling or something. I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to blame it on him.
There we go. Dang it, Satan. Okay. Let's go and talk about the topic that I'm really excited about with this one, and that is Christology. So what I find is that there are some arguments that come up all the time, and they are pretty easily challenged. And then there are some ideas that are more rooted in like biblical scholarship that I don't hear about as much. And we're going to talk next week about another one of those ideas that I'm also really excited to jump into. But we've also talked about already in this episode, like the last 116 pages, and we've talked about the mound builder myth, and those are ideas that are really, really common that come into play. A View of the Hebrews is one that comes in all the time. We've talked about the Spalding theory in the first episode. All right, so we've talked about these ideas that show up all over the place, and then ideas like Christology and how like the development of how Jesus became God. That doesn't really get talked about in these circles as much. And I don't know why. And I think that these are arguments that are way more interesting and way more convincing about the Book of Mormon in its context and how it was written.
And I'll be honest with you, until we started doing this, Christology was not anything I had ever been exposed to.
Yeah, it wasn't until I started like looking at stuff that was talking about like biblical scholarship that I even heard of this. This did not come up in any apologetic discussions that I'd had with people as a believer or as a skeptic. Like I had not heard about this until I got into into like, again, like lay level biblical studies. This is a fascinating topic, and we'll highly recommend, just to kind of at the outset, if you're really interested in going into this more, Bart Ehrman has a ton of stuff on this subject. Reza Aslan's Zealot is a great book. It's a little bit more pop history, but I find it a lot more accessible, that talks about the development of this idea and that puts in the Jesus of Nazareth into his historical context. Dan McClellan has talked extensively on this as well, and we all know what a fan I am for. I think I've talked about Dan McClellan in every episode, and I probably will continue to talk about Dan McClellan's scholarship going forward.
You brought me to the well of Dan. I drink deeply now. Thank you.
He just has so many videos on so many different topics, and some of them I'll agree with others that like some of those videos are better than other videos. But when he talks about his scholarship, it's fantastic, and I really enjoy the presentation there. And I like the association with the LDS perspective when he brings that in limited ways as well. I think it's an interesting approach to biblical scholarship. But let's get into the historical development of Christology, how this actually worked. So one thing we do need to understand is that the idea of Jesus as the Messiah is very much rooted in Second Temple ideas, Second Temple Jewish ideas, post-Maccabean revolt ideas, and Greco-Roman philosophies. All of those are going to come into play in big ways in developing this idea of Jesus as the Messiah, as the anointed one of Israel. So with the Second Temple, you start to get this move away from this idea of Adonai as one God in a pantheon of gods, to Adonai as sitting on top of a council of gods, to Adonai as the only God that's actually in existence. And all of these other gods either represent like angels or divine beings or demons, depending on what their role is. And this is a slow, steady evolution, but it doesn't really start to come up as what we recognize as monotheism until the Second Temple. So post-exile, the Jews come back from Babylon. So after the Book of Mormon starts, and that's when monotheism, as anything close to monotheism as we recognize today, starts to actually develop. And those are the ideas that will ultimately lead to this idea of Jesus as the Messiah, and then ultimately to like Trinitarian ideas, and then to the pushback that comes in from the broader Mormonism movement, specifically among the Brighamites as they hold on to it post-Nauvoo. Since the Community of Christ has gone back to a Trinitarian view, and the Book of Mormon puts forward in its first edition very clearly a Trinitarian view of monotheism. Okay.
And see, my interest in this is, so at what spurred the changing of the monotheistic Adonai low, before even any Christology, what took it from that towards the more monotheistic view?
So one of the huge evolutions that actually comes in, so when you have like Adonai as the top of a pantheon, and he's worshipped in the land of Israel or the land of Judah, and that's it, right? I mean, that's where he's worshipped. That is the land over which he presides, and he's the head of that pantheon. But other gods exist in there over other lands, to this idea that there is only Adonai, and
Yes.
all of the there are no other gods. That development starts because during the exile, the Jews that were taken into Babylon wanted to continue worshiping Adonai, but they were now no longer in the land under which Adonai presided. And so they needed some theological innovations to continue that practice. And so they needed to move Adonai out of the land and make him over the wider world.
Right.
And so then this starts to become the seed that then propels this evolution to the idea of there is only Adonai. And this council of gods is like lesser divinities, lesser, angels, and all of that. That now we're constituting this council that is underneath Adonai, but only Adonai is God. To now there are no other gods. It's just Adonai, and everything else is angels or demons that are not gods. They're not divine beings per se. They're just they're elevated.
Would this be when the idea of archangels come in, or?
I believe so. There are ideas of angels and things that precede that, and you have like ideas of angels in and like higher angels in the Near East that could all act as influences to all of that. I am not 100% expert into, or I'm not expert in any of this, but like I haven't dived too deeply into. No, I haven't dived too deeply into angels and the development of like angelology, and and when the archangels would have come in. I think my understanding is that a lot of those ideas are Second Temple and later, and really rooted in like Greco-Roman philosophies as well. I know that that the books of Enoch, which are written in the 2nd century CE at the earliest, wind up influencing a lot of that development as well.
That gives me the better time frame. I'm on board now.
Okay.
I mean, I'm always on board, but
yeah.
I get it better now.
So after the you have the Second Temple, you've got the worships then of Adonai, then you have Alexander the Great conquering the Levant and doing his whole thing and setting up his empire. He dies, and then his empire is still around, but it's fracturing and splintering. You get the Maccabean revolt that pushes them out and really instills this idea of like Adonai is friggin' awesome. Look at how great we did in resisting this greater power. And then you have the Roman conquest, and that Roman conquest and oppression of Israel is what sets the stage for Jesus and his ministry and all that. So Jesus of Nazareth is an itinerant rabbi. Like the historical Jesus, no matter what you think of him otherwise, is this. He is an itinerant rabbi who's going around preaching ideas that were challenging to the status quo in terms of Israel and its views, but also to the Roman powers. And depending on your level of accepting the historical Jesus beyond that, he may have been going from the point of seeing himself as an heir to the Davidic throne, which is this low, like kind of the low idea of what the Messiah's role was, but also like the common prevailing view. This is often disparaged by Christian apologists who are like, oh, the Jews didn't even understand their own prophecies. They talked about the Messiah being like next to God or God himself. But like messianic prophecies, and as much as they were there before Jesus, do point to a military figure that restores the Davidic reign. David was a Messiah. He was anointed, and the Messiahs that would follow would be in that line. And that was what is intended by the Jewish understanding of messianic power and authority. This is what Jesus was supposed to do. And this is why he's executed by the Roman authorities, is because he sees himself in some way, has publicly put himself forward as a Messiah, and is therefore in rebellion and insurrection against the Roman authorities. And that is one of the only crimes that's going to get you crucified. under Roman authority.
So this was an entirely new concept to me, because my understanding of Messiah was always Son of God, only one of them coming to save the planet.
And that's just, I mean, I understand why you would have that view. It's
Right.
not an accurate view of Messiah. David
Right. And
himself,
so
like,
this was
yeah,
amazing.
yeah, David has that label attached to him. So you already have an exception to that, because all the way back in the Old Testament, you know, with King David, you've got this going on.
Yeah.
These ideas are tied into an individual being anointed to preside over Israel, to preside over the kingdom of Adonai, right? Israel is the kingdom of God. This is the kingdom over which Adonai presides. We've now expanded that idea because of monotheism to be the entire world in some sense or another. But
Right.
old ideas die hard, right? And so
Yeah.
Israel is the place in which Adonai is worshipped. He may be the only God in actual existence, but this is the place where he is worshipped. And so the anointed one of Adonai will be here in Israel and will be over Israel. And this is insurrectionist against the Roman authority that is present. And so Jesus winds up being executed. No matter what level of Christology you hold, no matter what position you hold, if there was in as much as there was a historical Jesus of Nazareth who did the things described in the Gospels, this is what he was executed for.
I believe absolutely believe there was a historical rabbi named Jesus. I was watching, I want to say Mormon stories again. Mormon stories, I love you. And they were discussing how, so I'm trying to put it back into words. So Jesus, as the historical person, did some great things. Water to wine, probably not. Raising the dead, probably, I don't know, but as a person, he very much existed. And as a rabbi and as a religious influencer, he existed. Whether he did all the stuff in the Bible, that's the whole point of religion. But as a person, I very much believe he existed.
For me, so there are some interesting now developing mythicist arguments that the whole like figure of Jesus is entirely myth. There are some interesting arguments. Dr. Richard Carrier is the proponent, really pushing like that particular perspective. But it is very much fringe, incredibly on the fringes of scholarship. The overwhelming majority of scholarship will basically agree with exactly what you said. There was this historical figure, this itinerant rabbi named Yeshua, who was preaching some ideas that may or may not be reflected in the modern Gospels, who was ultimately killed for what he was teaching. And that's what we know about him. And for me, one of the things that I find most compelling about that, and the mythicists have their case against that, and there are some who don't really hold this position as being compelling. I do find it compelling, is that the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke they don't match, and they go through so much trouble to move the birth of Jesus, who was known to be from Nazareth, down to Bethlehem.
To December. Yeah, and the time frame, and
they go through all of this work to move him to Bethlehem to be born. That it just the only reason why you would feel the need to do that is if you had this person who was known to be from Nazareth serving as the inspiration for the story, but you need, in order for him to fulfill prophecy, be born in Bethlehem.
Well, I mean, look at Santa Claus. I mean, how many Santa origin stories are there? He was an actual historical person who has become mythicized over the centuries, not unlike our buddy Jesus.
Yeah. It doesn't take long for myth to develop. This is one of the apologists, like Christian apologetic arguments about how we can know that like Jesus was resurrected and did the miracle things is because it takes so long for like legend to develop. But at the time of recording this will seem pretty prescient because we're recording this a little bit in advance of releasing. But think about the myth and legend that has already arisen around a certain event at the U.S. Capitol a few years ago, and how those stories, developed out pretty much immediately from it, and we have access to like video, we have access to writings, like we can lock in ideas very, very clearly, and yet myth and legend arises almost instantaneously. Why wouldn't that happen in an oral culture with this Jesus fellow?
Well, and look at this, you know, when you're discussing mythicizing a lore, oh my gosh, YouTube world, you are welcome to yell at me and give me heck for this. There was, I mean, as far as time frame between 2020, early 2024, and the creation of the railroad, his last name is Henry or his first name is Henry, but he becomes a Paul Bunyan type historical mythical creature, how he can lay track faster than the machines coming in, and that's not even what 100 years ago, 100 200 years ago. I mean, that is not the time in which he existed is not that far from now, and look at what he's become.
Right. And in the case of Jesus, I mean, we can look at the Gospels and see this evolution of myth anyway. So we talked a little bit about, sorry, that was a weird slip of the tongue. We talked about Mosiahan priority earlier in this, and on that we talked a little bit about Markian priority. Well, Markian priority states that Mark is the first gospel written. Matthew and Luke are written at roughly the same time. I think that most scholars put Matthew a little bit ahead of Luke, but it honestly doesn't matter. And then John is the last one that's written. And what we see in that is that Mark has what's called low Christology. And low Christology is this idea that Jesus, this itinerant rabbi who most likely existed in history, and we'll go with he did until the scholarship shows otherwise, was adopted as the Son of God, adopted as the Messiah at the time of his baptism. And this, basically a low Christology will take this idea of Jesus being adopted as the Son of God at some point in time after his birth.
Now, my question to that is, when you say adopted Son of God, was God a willing participant, or was this like a symbolic, I am giving myself to God, not unlike a nun, or?
Oh, I mean, this is, so like you have the idea of the Spirit descending upon Jesus at the time, and then he's declared as the beloved Son of God. Like, this is like that contract of sorts that's made at that time.
Okay.
And yeah, so Matthew puts that forward pretty explicitly as well. Though Matthew has what I think is a slightly higher Christology than Mark does. Mark's is the lowest. Matthew goes higher, Luke goes higher. By the time you get to John, Jesus is not adopted as the Son of God at all, at any point. He is co-eternal with God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and this is the Word is Jesus. Like, he is co-eternal, he's always existed, he is God himself. He's and there are some that dispute that particular reading. Nonetheless, the Christology of John is very high. It is to that point of basically putting Jesus co-equal with God. And if you think about Trinitarian ideas that are going to eventually come forward, they also put Jesus co-equal with God. The Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit are three in one and one in three, and they are equal with each other, and each has their individual role, and also they are the same. And Trinitarian ideas are confusing, but
totally makes sense. 100%.
Yeah. But part of where this is coming from, where this is developing from, is this higher Christology. And we'll talk about Revelation next week. But Revelation is another text that has a very high Christology. And you can actually see in the text of Revelation a development of that. Initially, that God and Jesus are separate, and then Jesus declares himself God later on in the text. And this helped to solidify power. It helped to basically declare the Arians, who had a lower Christology, as having heretical doctrines by the time we get to the Council of Nicaea. And this is a slow development, right? We're talking like 300 years at least of argumentation from the time we have this itinerant rabbi who then becomes like the Messiah, who then becomes the Son of God, who then becomes God himself, going through this whole evolution slowly over time of argument and debate and different groups developing these ideas, all leaning on Second Temple ideas and post-Maccabean revolt ideas and Greco-Roman philosophies, all blending together to create this figure of Jesus who is God.
Okay.
And just really to emphasize this historical idea that this is a slow development. Paul has a very low Christology. Really doesn't even talk about the life of Jesus. Mark has a low Christology. John has a high Christology. And that it takes time. Paul's our earliest writer in the New Testament, writes fairly close actually to after the time of Jesus. I think about 40 CE or so. Mark ends up being about 70 CE. John is all the way in the 90s to perhaps even into the 2nd century. And Revelation as well is out there, getting into the 2nd century by the time it's written.
And with the time change and with the alteration through time, God, religion, it's its own type of pop culture, and it's going to change as the needs of the worshipers change.
Exactly. They're going to negotiate these ideas going forward to suit their own purposes.
Exactly.
And their own rhetorical goals. And I'm definitely echoing somebody there that you should also check out for some of this scholarship with that statement. Yeah, McClellan. Sorry.
Who is that? I've never heard you talk about this person
I don't
before.
bring this up very often, do I? It's honestly a problem at this point. Okay. So now let's talk about Lehi. So we've done this historical work in establishing how Christology developed. Now we have Lehi, who is a First Temple Jew after the learning of the Jews, right? In the language of the Egyptians, the learning of the Jews.
I was going to say, learning of the Jews.
And he is going to, he's just had this vision of the tree of life that we're going to get more details about next week. But he's just had this vision, and now he's going to put forward these ideas about this Messiah who's coming. And it all reflects a Johannine Christology, this high Christology. Where did this come from, right? So imagine that Lehi is shown in vision, this itinerant rabbi, his life, his teachings, and his crucifixion and death, resurrection. Even with all that in mind, he doesn't have the monotheism necessary to understand Christology in that context. He doesn't have these Greco-Roman philosophies to contribute to that understanding. What he would walk away from is not a Christology we would actually recognize, because he has a First Temple idea about Adonai and about his role in the pantheon.
Or maybe slay Lehi, he was a trendsetter.
Maybe, but he would have to have been such a trendsetter. I mean, we're skipping steps, right? We're skipping steps that are taking hundreds of years to develop. So
we're not skipping steps. We're skipping entire journeys.
We are. And, so I just try to imagine like this, he has what is similar to a polytheistic worldview. And if you take Jesus and put him into a polytheistic worldview, what do you have? You have something that's going to resemble maybe a Hercules type character.
I was going to say
Gilgamesh figure.
Demigod.
Demigods, right? And it's just going to nestle right in. You don't need to do all this negotiation to make him like co-equal with God, co-eternal with God. And yet that's what Lehi is going to do. And that's strange. It's really, really strange. And it is a theological anachronism that it doesn't fit with the character. It doesn't fit with who this person would be historically. Now, it fits really well with Joseph Smith, right? I mean, with the 19th century context, like,
oh, sure.
This is a great polemic for 19th century Protestantism, especially American Protestantism.
When you start having, I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep talking.
No, you're good.
You have a lot of the same problems with the historical accuracy when it comes to this scenario as you would, or as we came across when we discussed Laban and the sword type and the materials. There's just no way you're going to be able to make it fit historically.
Right. you have certain pieces that are eventually going to lead down this road. I mean, historically speaking, these pieces, most of the pieces, the most basic level, most fundamental level exist, except there's a certain catalyst that hasn't occurred. And that's the catalyst that creates what we understand as monotheism. Like that, which is essential for developing this Christology. There's no reason, there's no mechanism even for developing this Christology without a more monotheistic look at deity. And that is not going to come about until after the exile.
So would not be, this is probably the worst analogy ever, but this is the way that my brain makes it make sense. So you've got Benjamin Franklin thinking, kind of batting around the idea of electricity. You have the catalyst, the literal key on the kite string, and that's what brings about electricity. And here you've got them discussing virtual reality to a man that is still, religiously speaking, doesn't even have the key on the kite string yet.
Right. That's actually not bad. Yeah, that there are so many innovations that have to occur to lead to virtual reality, from even the discovery of electricity. But at least with electricity, and how that works and being able to capture that, like that at least gets you down the road, going on that path. But no, you don't even have that yet. And so you're fumbling in the dark on that
legitimately.
Yeah. And yeah, if you suck somebody in who has no concept of electricity to this idea of virtual reality, their understanding of that is not going to resemble anything like ours.
No way. No way.
And they'll have an understanding, they just won't talk about it in the way that we would talk about it. And that's exactly what we should see with Lehi and his Christology. If he's seeing these ideas, he shouldn't have the same understanding of those ideas as a 19th century Protestant. But what he puts forward is very much consistent, if not exactly, 19th century Protestantism.
Almost like 19th century Protestant created the character.
That's what it looks like, right? It's indiscernible from that particular situation. So if we go with there was a historical Lehi who did all these things, it can't be distinguished with the evidence that we have from a 19th century Protestant just creating this character and giving him these ideas. And when we can't distinguish between those two, we should go with the case that requires fewer assumptions. And that is, a guy made a book with these characters. Now we might be able to use these stories in ways that are valuable for scripture and for understanding lessons about our place in the world and how to interact with others. And one of those that I would actually suggest is, if we look at forgiveness in the Book of Mormon, forgiveness is a big topic. And this gets brought up in the Come Follow Me manual as, that there's a whole section that really talks about Nephi's decision to frankly forgive his brothers. There are physical and mental health benefits to forgiving others that we can corroborate with evidence today. We can show that there are benefits to having that attitude. There are dangers as well, though. And too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. And I worry that if we overemphasize Nephi's actions here, we might go in maybe a bit too extreme. Nephi is maybe forgiving in this section too far, because it can put us in situations where our lives and health are in danger if we're too forgiving, right? If you forgive an abuser, for instance, that can be dangerous. But if you're, forgiving somebody who's taking actions to right wrongs and to do better, that can be beneficial for everybody. And, we need to exercise judgment and be judicious in the way that we go about doing that. But yeah, the Book of Mormon does present a case for this, for being forgiving towards other people. And that
be forgiving, but set boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we can look at the story of Nephi and see that, by not setting boundaries, he continues to suffer harms and all that. And that's something that should be avoided.
Don't let your brothers tie you up and beat you.
Yeah, which is going to happen several more times after this.
So many more times.
But there are opportunities for exercising forgiveness in ways that are healthy and beneficial. And to frankly forgive somebody can be a wonderful act. And yeah, the Book of Mormon does present that in ways that are positive. And I think that we can find utility in this text still, even recognizing that the 19th century fingerprints are all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agreed. Agreed. Just because a book isn't historically accurate, I take inspiration from Alice in Wonderland every day, and I'm still not 100% convinced that that's a historical document.
Yeah, it does have a couple of claims in it that do seem to suggest that it might be less than historical.
Maybe, just maybe.
All right. So next week we're going to talk about the vision of the tree of life a little bit. We'll talk about how Nephi discusses the history of his people, essentially his apocalypse. Right, the apocalypse of Nephi is what we'll be referring to mostly throughout that section. We'll talk about world history until just after the American Revolution and how that ties in with Nephi's apocalypse. And then we'll get into some of the troubles that Nephi gets into with what he presents and how we might be able to use that to evaluate the historicity of the text even further.
Oh, that wacky Nephi. What will he get into next?
Oh, there's always some fun and shenanigans. But with that, thank you so much for joining us today. You all are a wonderful audience. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, give us that sweet, sweet engagement for the algorithm. Check out our sources down in the description. And, obviously we've plugged quite a few different scholars and works and all that. Be sure to check those out because they are great.
Oh,
and
don't forget Dan McClellan.
Don't forget Dan McClellan. Hey Dan, by the way, if you're watching this at this point in time, say hi or whatever. All right. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next week.
Bye.